Hello and welcome to episode 477 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leeks. Damien, welcome back to the show. How you doing?
Excited, Andy. The app is going to be going out to those of you who signed up via our Facebook group to help test the app. So do keep an eye out in your inboxes, because those of you who have been selected to help, because we do it based upon a range of factors like devices. We've got a range of different types of phones using the app, and so we can see all different permutations. So if you are picked to help us, then do please go and have a look at the instructions. You should be getting that perhaps already by the time you hear this podcast or in the coming days. So that is very exciting. Just to jump back quickly to last week, there's been some interesting news that's happened in the last few days. There's been a wave of new switching deals, so bank account switching offers that have come out. I think there were 3 this week, and you get up to £200 for switching bank accounts. They're always incredibly popular, but what is interesting is a number of them can now be used on package bank accounts with the likes of Lloyds and the Co-op. We'll put links to the switching article that we have, so you can go through and look at the deals and look at what you actually get. But with the Co-op, for example, their packaged account has a fee of £15 a month, and with that you get mobile phone insurance, worldwide travel insurance, and breakdown cover. But the switching offer that you get more than compensates for a year's worth of the packaged bank account fees, which theoretically means that you get paid around about £5 by them to have all of those benefits: mobile phone insurance, travel insurance, and breakdown cover for a year. So that makes it a very good deal. Of course, there's loads of T's and C's you have to bear in mind, things you have to do to qualify. But for people who use the account regularly, that shouldn't be a problem. But similarly for Lloyds, they have a £200 switching offer that will go quite a way towards covering the cost of the fee for a large part of the year on their top package bank account. So we'll put links in the notes to that, because that makes package bank accounts even more likely to be value for money for people out there. So Andy, I'm going to jump straight to what's going to be covered in this week's show, because we've got a lot to get through. The first piece is an investment piece. I'm going to be talking about how the upcoming US election is likely to impact investment markets. So we're just under a month until the voting day. So there are historical precedents that we can look at to see how markets might be impacted, and therefore how your investments themselves could be impacted. I'm then going to talk about ghost brokers, a scam you need to watch out for, that I think a lot of people are falling foul of because of social media. So that's going to be interesting, particularly for people who may be young, using social media a lot. I'm thinking of students here. They are often some of the people who fall victim to this type of scam. And then Andy, the last piece on the show, you're going to be talking about.
We're going to be talking about child trust funds. There's been some recent figures come out from HMRC in terms of how many of those child trust funds have matured, and actually how many of those haven't been claimed. So I'll be talking about that and exactly what people can do in terms of managing their child trust funds, but also transferring them across into an alternative product, something like a junior ISA. We'll be talking about that at the end of the show. So Damien, let's crack on with the first piece then. You're going to be talking about the US election.
So the US election, it may seem quite far off in terms of distance, but it has a big impact around the globe. So it influences investment markets, and there are historical precedents if you look back into how markets behave, particularly stock markets, before, during, and after an election vote. So what I want to do in this piece is go through some of those historical precedents, give you an idea, an overview of how it could impact your portfolio. And this is coming from a piece of research that I published this week for 80/20 investor members. So if you want to see the wider piece, I'm only going to touch upon some of the key bits from that research. Then, of course, you could take out a free trial of 80/20 investor. So let's just start off with the first thing with the US election, predicting who will win. Now, the stock market does have a pretty good track record of predicting who will win the US election. So on 12 of the last 14 occasions where the stock market, where I'm talking about the stock market, I'm talking about the S&P 500, rose during the 3 months before a US election, then the incumbent party won. So in this instance, that means if the S&P 500, when we get to the start of November, so the election is on the 5th of November, if we get to that point and the 3 month performance of the S&P 500 is positive, then it would suggest that the incumbent, which would be the Democrats, will win the US election. Now, conversely, in 8 of the 9 occasions where the stock market fell during that 3 months period before the election, then the incumbent party lost. So if you do the numbers there, you will see that as an indicator of whether the incumbent party wins or loses, it's a pretty good indicator. It has over 80% success rate. Interestingly, 2020 was one of the rare occasions where the indicator got it wrong. So if you looked at the 3 months performance of the S&P 500 ahead of the 2020 US election, what we had was the S&P 500 rallied almost 10% before pulling back and then attempting to rally again. And then in the days before the election, actually started to dip towards negative territory for that 3 month period. In that case, that would have predicted that Joe Biden was going to win the election, which he ultimately did. But then in the days before the election, we saw a rebound in the S&P 500 of 3%. So over that whole period, the S&P 500 was up 3%, which suggested that Donald Trump was going to win the election, as I've just mentioned. And as we know, he didn't. So the indicator was wrong. So it's like all of these indicators that you have out there, they aren't foolproof and there's no guarantee that they will work. But anyway, let's just look what's going on in 2024. As we make this podcast, and we're a month away from the US election, the S&P 500 is up over 10% since the start of August, which is the starting point of that 3 month period before the US election in 2024. So if the incumbent is going to win, then obviously we would see the S&P 500 stay in positive territory, even if we see a slight pullback. But as long as it stays positive, then that indicator would suggest that Kamala Harris is going to win. But if Trump is going to win, then we're going to need to see probably a 10% plus pullback on the S&P 500 if that indicator is to hold true. And so if you look at it at face value, does that suggest we could potentially be due a bit of volatility and a pullback on the S&P 500? Well, ahead of a US election, you always tend to get a bit of volatility, and that could come from when we start to hear some of the policies, particularly if it's to do with tariffs and China, and if that comes from Trump in particular, who obviously in his previous time in office imposed tariffs on China. So that could be a source of volatility. But if we look at how the S&P 500 performs generally ahead of US elections anyway, then in the 3 month period before an election, then what we typically get is if the incumbent wins, a 3% rally in the S&P 500. So we have got more than that at the moment. So again, that tends to suggest if history is going to repeat, that we're going to pull back a bit from the 10% that we've currently got. So by the time we get to the US election at the start of November, then that 3 month performance is back down towards 3%. Of course, history doesn't repeat. It can often rhyme, but it very rarely repeats. If the incumbent loses, then we tend to see a pullback of about 3.9%. So if Trump is going to win, then we could see a negative reaction to the stock market anyway if history does repeat. And on a 1 month basis, if we just look at that, how does the stock market, the S&P 500, usually perform ahead of an election date? Well, if the incumbent wins, then it's up about 1.6%. If the incumbent loses, then it generally falls 0.5%. The point is that where we are at the moment, up over 10% since the start of August, we are at lofty valuations. The market is hitting new all-time highs when we're talking about the S&P 500. It does seem to fit that with all of those measures and all of those indicators that I've been talking about, that we could see a bit of a pullback heading into the US election. And that would still fit with historical norms for a US election. So that is something to bear in mind. We're not saying it's necessarily going to happen. What about after the election? Well, typically what you get is if the incumbent loses, you get a slightly positive reaction. Not much, but after the first 24 hours, the S&P 500 is typically up about 0.7%. You tend to get after a week, it'd be about 0.3%. But then towards a month, the S&P 500 is up 1.6%. If the incumbent wins, then you tend to get a negative reaction up until a month after the election. And so after a day, it's down 0.3%. After a week, it's down 0.7%, and a month, it's down 0.6% in total. So not big numbers, but maybe that's because after the incumbent wins, people think they've got a pretty good idea of what to expect from the next 4 years. So that might not be something to get excited about. So that is interesting. So moving on, what happens typically during the next period of office? So the best year in office for most presidents is the third year. So that's when the S&P 500 typically has its best year, up over 13%. The worst year is usually year 2, and that's followed by year 1. So that means that as you're going into that first year and into the second year, you start to tend to see the stock market underperform. Now, you could probably come up with various reasons why that could be, whether it's them actually enacting policies, etc. But it just goes to show that there is a variability throughout the tenure of being in office. Now, the next question is, does it matter who wins? Now, I'm not going to go through all the details, but the stock market historically tends to prefer if the Democrats win. So the average annual return when the Democrats are in power is 15% a year. When it's a Republican president, it's 9.1%. So there's quite a difference. So you might be wondering why the difference. Is it just chance? Now, if you look at the individual presidencies, then it becomes quite clear that the overriding factor that determined whether the stock market did well during a period of office was actually a wider macroeconomic factor. So you've got to think about the financial crisis. You've got to think about the pandemic that had a huge impact on the stock market, and even things like the Great Depression. Now, if you look at the numbers, 10 of the last 11 US recessions began under Republican presidents. So when you get a recession, it tends to be negative for the stock market. And so you could look at that and say, well, they've just been unlucky. The thing is, if you do the numbers, yes, the Republicans have had more recessions, and some of that is perhaps beyond their control if we look at things like the pandemic. But having 10 of the last 11 recessions starting under a Republican, that statistically is more than just chance. That isn't just unlucky. So that suggests that the market does prefer to have a Democratic president. The other thing I want to touch upon is how the election is won that influences how the US stock market will perform. So it's not just about the president, but it's also who controls the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the detail, but suffice to say that the stock market actually performs best if you get a Democratic president and you get a divided Congress. So that means that you've got one party controlling the House of Representatives and the other controlling the Senate. So under that instance, that is when you tend to get the best outcome. Even if you get a Republican president, it's still the better outcome in terms of the annualized return on the S&P 500 if it is divided. And that does kind of make sense in some way, because it means that not one party has absolute control over US politics. So I'm not going to go to all the other details about how other assets perform, but one thing I will touch upon, if you look at the previous elections, which particular asset has done quite well. Democratic presidents have tended to be quite good the following year for the NASDAQ, so US tech stocks. That's just a hint. So if we see a Democratic president, perhaps, depends on their policies, it might be positive for the NASDAQ going forward. So that gives you an overview of what could happen with US stock markets. And obviously what happens with US stock markets has a major influence on what happens with other markets. And of course, one big thing we're going to have to bear in mind, if we start getting talk about tariffs, then that can start to influence particular sectors within the US economy, but also other geographies. So it could start to impact maybe Chinese equities or emerging markets. So that's something to bear in mind as well. And the other thing is the US dollar. The US dollar tends to determine how all sorts of assets perform, from commodities to emerging market assets, for example. And the US dollar tends to strengthen in the 100 days after a US election. So that means that you could see some headwinds if the dollar strengthens for things like US equities, because it tends to be negative for US equities if the US dollar strengthens for an extended period of time. That could be also negative for emerging market assets and even commodities. So that's a roundup of what could happen to investments because of the US election. In the research article, I do also cover some notes from investment banks on particular sectors that they expect to do well and those that might not, given certain scenarios, so certain wins, because it's actually quite a close race. So whether Trump wins or Kamala Harris wins. So that is something to bear in mind as well. And often when it's a close race, that does tend to be positive for US equities as well. So that's something else that could be a positive heading into that year end, when we then start talking about Santa rally.
Okay, so let's move on to the next piece then. We're going to be talking about ghost brokers. Now, these are on the rise and they're particularly prevalent amongst the young, and social media is part of the problem. What have we got?
So before I start this piece, anybody who's watching the video will probably see me trying not to laugh, because obviously off air, every time we said the word ghost brokers, we've been singing it to the Ghostbusters tune. But ghost brokers is a term that relates often to car insurance. So what is a ghost broker? A ghost broker is somebody who poses as a broker to sell insurance fraudulently. And as Andy has mentioned, it often is used, or we see this type of scam on social media. So what they tend to do is they will sell fake or invalid insurance policies, typically for car insurance. And part of the reason that car insurance is a target market is because social media obviously has a significant number of people who might be young using it, who are struggling with having to pay very high car insurance premiums. And for example, there might be students going to university and they're looking for ways to reduce their car insurance. Now, one of the reasons why we're seeing more of this type of scam is that 1 in 5 young people, I hate that phrase, but 1 in 5 young people use social media to search for car insurance. And so they might stumble across one of these ghost brokers. So the ghost broker may offer something that is a very cheap premium. And then what commonly happens is that you don't find out that you've actually been a victim until you either get stopped by the police or that you try and make a claim. So how ghost brokers often operate is they may offer you a seemingly valid insurance policy from a brand and insurance company that you know at a very low cost premium. But they may forge documents they send you, or they might buy real policies with false information to reduce the premium. Therefore, that actually invalidates the insurance because it's actually using false information. Or what they do is buy genuine policies and then cancel them shortly after you've purchased them, which actually leaves you uninsured, but they've taken your money. And they will use professional looking websites, sophisticated ads, and as I said, forged documents to give the appearance that this is a genuine sale via a broker. Now, often the adverts from these fraudsters are actually on social media, but also on online forums, or they use messaging apps or rely on word of mouth. So people passing on the details of where they've got cheap car insurance from, and then those people fall foul of the scam. So what happens if you do actually fall foul of a ghost broker? Well, as I've mentioned, your insurance would be invalid when you try and make a claim or you're stopped by police. And you do face potential fines, driving bans, or even having your car seized and crushed. Effectively, you're treated as somebody who's driving without insurance. So that is something that is a very serious and is actually a crime. Research shows that nearly 8 out of 10 people are unaware of this type of scam. So let's talk about red flags. The sort of thing you should be looking for that could be a sign that something is potentially a ghost broker is unsolicited offers through social media, calls or emails offering very cheap insurance, brokers using only mobile phone numbers or messaging apps for contact, missing or tampered documents. If you get documents and they do look like they've been altered in some way, then that should be a red flag. And also requests for cash payments. That is another red flag. So how can you avoid them? Obviously, only use reputable companies. You could buy directly from insurers, or you use a price comparison site to compare prices to try and reduce your premiums that way. You can also go and verify the broker via the Financial Conduct Authority website or the British Insurance Brokers Association. If you are unsure whether a broker you are using is genuine and you're unsure whether the offer is genuine, then you could contact the insurer directly to check the offer. Also, the other thing to do is check online reviews to check that the broker is genuine. Obviously, keep an eye out for negative reviews and feedback. There's also the obvious housekeeping rules about using things online. Check the URLs for safe connections, Also, make sure you look out for any spelling mistakes and obvious errors on websites that make it seem fake, that it's actually been just thrown up overnight. So the message on this part of the podcast is that if you are on social media or you're using anything like a messaging app, or you've had a word of mouth, maybe a friend has said about a way they've got cheap car insurance, do be skeptical and do make sure you check things out properly to validate that it's actually genuine. Because if you don't, then you could be uninsured, but you also could end up having more severe consequences, as I mentioned earlier in the piece.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. We're going to be talking about child trust funds because there were some recent figures that were announced by HMRC this week. Quite staggering numbers in terms of the amount of unclaimed child trust funds that are out there. There's currently 670,000 child trust funds that have matured and are yet to be claimed. So I thought it was a good piece to bring to the podcast to remind people what a child trust fund is. So child trust funds were introduced back in 2002, and it was the government's idea to create a way of gifting money to children in the form of a voucher that the parents could contribute to as well. And it would produce an amount of money that would mature when the child turns 18. Now, important, this money that is building up cannot be touched by the parent. In fact, the only thing a parent could do at the time was to choose the provider. And that kind of leads me to where we are now, because if the parent didn't invest that money and choose the provider themselves, then the government did it for them. So when ultimately the child trust funds were stopped in 2011, that meant there were lots of child trust funds out there, and it left many parents and now children turning into adults not knowing that these things exist. So the reason I'm bringing it to the pod now is to kind of make people aware that these things exist. 2002 to 2011, it's a long time. In fact, there are over 6.3 million child trust funds that were issued during that time. And so I'm just going to briefly tell listeners how they can check themselves to see if there's a child trust fund out there and how to track down who the provider is. So there is a really useful HMRC tool, which I'll put links to in the show notes, where you can track it down. Now, parents just need to provide the child's full name, their address and date of birth, as well as any previous names if the child's changed their names in that time. And if the child has turned 16 and they have a national insurance number, that can also be provided to help speed up the checking process. Children over the age of 16 can track down their own child trust fund if they want, so long as they have that national insurance number. And just to be aware that if your child is 16 and they're searching for their own child trust fund, then they may well need to set up a government gateway ID as well. So just make them aware of that. Once you've submitted the forms to HMRC, you'll be contacted within around 3 weeks, and they should be able to provide you with details of who the trust fund provider is and how to take that on to the next stage. It will either be phoning them up or logging in online if you've got the child trust fund number. So what do you do once you've found your child trust fund? Well, you've got a number of choices. If it hasn't matured yet, you may decide that you want to move that into something like a junior ISA, which were subsequently created once the child trust funds were discontinued in 2011. And Damien, I'll bring you in here because this is something you've done, right?
Yeah, so my first daughter had a child trust fund, and the problem with child trust funds is that they are generally expensive. They were a product that had very few investment options if you had one where you could invest. They were poor value for money, and then junior ISAs come along, and junior ISAs now are low cost, they're competitive, and there's a range of products, and there's a lot of new providers. So child trust funds were a legacy product that was just left to like wither on the vine. So obviously you could transfer to a junior ISA if the person is still a child. If the child who the child trust fund was for is an adult now, then technically they have the choice just to take the money and do what they want with it if they want to, or they could decide to start their own investment journey. So Andy, I think that's it on child trust funds. We'll put links in the notes of the show so people can find out a bit more if it impacts them. So like Andy said, there are a lot of people out there who may have a child trust fund that they don't realise that they have. But there are also going to be plenty of people who have moved house in that time, for example, and have lost contact with the child trust fund provider, even if they picked it themselves. If they chose the child trust provider, it wasn't the government. It's easy to do given the small amounts that were generally put in there by the government. So that is it for this week on the podcast. As ever, do make sure you leave a glowing 5-star review on whatever app of choice that you use to either watch or listen to this show. Please do go to the YouTube show, like and subscribe to the channel, or like the video, subscribe to the channel. Do follow us on all our social channels, so Instagram, Facebook, you name it, we're on it. Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And I should have mentioned earlier in a piece, just to reiterate about how car insurance is a very popular topic on social media. Our most popular ever post on Instagram, which was seen by over 100,000 people, was a post that we did. It was a clip from this very podcast about the best day to buy car insurance. So that just shows you how car insurance is a hot topic on social media, and it hit a nerve with that population. And you can see, obviously, it was generally people who were younger who were trying to save money on their car insurance because of those high premiums. Go and look, there's plenty of content that we don't put on the podcast that goes exclusively on our social media channel. So, Andy, I think all that's left is to say until next time.
Until next time.